I remember when my daughter was about 3 years old and we were getting ready to take her to the doctor. She didn't want to go, so she pulled her blankets over her head and just laid there very still, hoping we wouldn't see her. So I slowly peeled back the blanket and I said, "Come on, honey, it's time to go see the doctor." And she just kept her eyes shut and pulled the blanket back over her head. She just could not bring herself to face the reality that she had to go to the doctor. And in her cute little toddler mind, she thought closing her eyes and hiding under a blanket might make reality go away. This is the same sense I get when speaking with some of our Hebrew roots friends. They have their eyes closed and the blanket over their head, and when we try to peel the blanket back and show them how Scripture says that we're not under the law, and that's a good thing, they essentially squeeze their eyes shut and pull the blankets back over their head. I mean, the Galatians 5:8 literally says, if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Romans 7:6 says, we serve God in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. But for some reason, some of our Torah-keeping friends just can't or won't face that reality. It's almost like they find comfort in being under the law and they don't want anyone to take away their blankie. Now, I'm being a little silly with this analogy, of course, but the point is valid. For some reason, despite passage after passage showing that Christians are not under the law of Moses, that we are not to let anyone judge us on the food we eat or the days we keep, many Torah-keeping Christians will brush away those verses and cling to what they want to believe. And today we're going to look at a specific example of this. I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone quote the verse, "There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you." And then they use this to somehow support the idea that Gentile Christians today are under the Old Covenant law. The idea is that even under the Old Covenant, Gentiles were fully under the law, so the same must be true under the New Covenant, that there's one law and we're all under it. There are a number of problems with this line of logic, starting with the fact that that verse does not mean what they think it means. As we're going to see, it's not stating that the Gentiles who sojourn with the Israelites were subject to the entire law of Moses. And here's a sort of pro tip for those of you who are dealing with suspicious claims from Hebrew roots friends or family. Often, getting to the bottom of a claim is as simple as reading a verse in context. For example, Exodus 12:49. If we just open our Bible and go to Exodus 12 and read from verse 43 to verse 49, we'll discover what that verse is really saying. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. In fact, this idea of one law for both Israel and the foreigner actually appears 4 different times in the Torah. And we're going to look at each of them. And my hope is that this will help us respond more biblically the next time a Torah keeper cites these verses to argue this issue. Okay, let's see what this verse in Exodus 12 is all about. It occurs within the larger passage that runs from verses 43 through 49, which record the institution of Pesach, or Passover. So let's just read the text and see what it reveals, starting at verse 43. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "These are the regulations for the Passover meal. No foreigner may eat it." Okay, so right off the bat, we find a distinction between the native-born Israelites and foreigners. Now, as we'll see, Yahweh does allow a provision for non-Jews who want to keep the Passover later in this passage. But we don't want to miss the fact that God makes a very clear distinction in the Torah between foreigners and Israelites when issuing his commands. So let's keep reading. Verse 44. Any slave you have bought may eat it after you have circumcised him, but a temporary resident or a hired worker may not eat it. It must be eaten inside the house. Take none of the meat outside the house. Do not break any of the bones. The whole community of Israel must celebrate it. A foreigner residing among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all the males in his household circumcised. Then he may take part like one born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat it. The same law applies both to the native born and to the foreigner residing among you. that larger context provides some very helpful information so we can properly understand what it means when he says, the same law applies to both. Now, the first thing to notice is that it says in verse 47, it says, the whole community of Israel must celebrate it, right? So the Passover is a command specifically for Israel, and it applies to every Israelite. God didn't give them a choice. Israel must celebrate it. However, verse 48 says, a foreigner residing among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover. So for foreigners, celebrating a Passover is optional. That's a pretty significant difference. For the Israelites, Passover is required. For foreigners living among them, Passover is permitted, but it's not required. And for those foreigners who choose to keep the Passover, God says in verse 48, they must have all the males in his household circumcised. Then he may take part like one born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat it. So God allowed Gentiles in Israel to participate in the Passover meal under one condition. They needed to first show their allegiance to Yahweh by being circumcised, just like those born in the land were circumcised. So we're seeing a clear distinction here between the native-born Israelites and everyone else. Yahweh isn't looking at Israel as a mixed multitude gathered together in Egypt getting ready for the big Exodus. No, Israel is to be a holy nation to him. They're set apart from all the other nations, from the Gentiles. And that distinction is very clear in this passage. This is all about how to eat the Passover meal and who can partake in it. For the Israelites, celebrating the Lord's Passover is a requirement. For the Gentiles among them, it's optional. Okay, so all of those observations now help us address the verse in question with a better sense of context. Verse 49, the same law applies to both the native-born and to the foreigner residing among you. So what does this text mean when it says the same law applies? Or other translations say one law. So what law is this speaking of? Well, given the context of the passage, this is clearly not saying that the entire law of Moses applies to both Israelites and foreigners. And there are two reasons I say that. First, because as we've just seen, Gentiles are not required to keep the Passover, but Israelites are. And second, Israel was still in slavery in Egypt when God gave these Passover commands. The law of Moses hadn't even been given yet. So verse 49 isn't talking about the Mosaic law, but rather God's specific command that everyone who participates in the Passover meal must be circumcised. That is the law that applies to both the Israelites and the stranger who sojourns among them. Here's another passage our Torah-keeping friends often cite. Leviticus 24:22 says, you are to have the same law for the foreigner and the native-born. I am the Lord your God. And here we have the exact same scenario we just saw in Exodus 12. When taken on its own, this verse sounds like a slam dunk. But when you read it in context, the Torah-keeping argument evaporates. This verse is found in a passage that runs from verses 17 through 22, which is the discussion about the civil penalties in the ancient Israel. Now, some translations put a heading on this section of an eye for an eye. And interestingly, these 6 verses are kind of tucked in the middle of a story about a man who had cursed the name of the Lord. And that larger story reveals something pretty relevant to our discussion. So let's back up to verse 10 and read the story. Now the son of an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father went out among the Israelites. Okay, so this was a man who was half Israelite and half Egyptian. And a fight broke out in the camp between him and an Israelite. The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name with a curse. And the phrase, the name in Hebrew, is Hashem, which is a reference to God himself, which is why the NIV capitalizes name here in this verse. So this half-Gentile man got in a fight with an Israelite, and during that fight, the half-Gentile man blasphemed God and cursed his name. It says, so they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shlomith, the daughter of Divri, the Danite. They put him in custody until the will of the Lord should be made clear to them. So this story really gives us the sense of Israel as a brand new nation, fresh out of slavery, trying to figure out how to handle these situations. If it was a full-blown Israelite who blasphemed and cursed the God of Israel, they would have known what to do, because blasphemy is specifically prohibited in Exodus 22:28, and the penalty is death. But they knew that the law was only given to Israel, and because this guy was only half Israelite, they needed to ask the Lord how this should be handled, which again underscores the fact that the Israelites were set apart from all the other nations in the eyes of God, which is why they needed direction here. They knew the death penalty for blasphemy applied to Israelites, but what if someone was only half Israelite? So they took it to Yahweh. Verse 13. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Take the blasphemer outside the camp. All those who heard him are to lay their hands on his head, and the entire assembly is to stone him. Say to the Israelites, anyone who curses their God will be held responsible. Anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord is to be put to death. The entire assembly must stone them." And listen to this. Whether foreigner or native born, when they blaspheme the name, they are to be put to death. So God gave Israel his answer. And this is a really amazing thing about the Torah. God initially just gave Israel the 10 commandments. And as they started trying to live out those commandments, they kept finding situations like the one we're reading about here, where they weren't sure how to apply the law. So God gives a bunch of additional commands like this to help guide Israel. Jewish tradition holds that there are actually a total of 613 mitzvot, or commandments, given in the Torah. And in God's decree about the half-Israelite, we again see a clear distinction between the sojourner and the native. And in the case of blaspheming the holy living God, both are subject to the same penalty for this offense. So keep all that in mind as we now get to our eye for an eye passage. Here, God says, starting at verse 17, "Anyone who takes the life of a human being is to be put to death." So it's the death penalty for murder. Anyone who takes the life of someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. So it's a lesser penalty for killing an animal. Anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. Whoever kills an animal must make restitution, but whoever kills a human being is to be put to death. You are to have the same law for the foreigner and the native born. I am the Lord your God. Okay, so what these verses are establishing is a legal principle of appropriate retaliation. Yahweh says that the punishment must be commensurate with the crime. For example, if someone steps on your foot, you can't cut off his foot, and if he kills your sheep, you can't murder his family. The punishment has to fit the crime. And by the way, this is a sobering reminder of how holy and exalted the living God is, because the appropriate punishment for blaspheming and cursing him is death. And now we can rightly understand verse 22 because we have the context for it. The same law Yahweh is speaking of here isn't the entirety of the Mosaic law, it's the standard of appropriate retaliation. So on this issue, in response to the Israelites asking God, hey, you told us what the punishment was for an Israelite, but what about someone who's only half Israelite? And God's answer was that the same rules of punishment apply to the sojourner and the native. So in this passage, the same law that applies to the foreigner and the native born is not the entirety of the Old Covenant law, but God's laws about appropriate retaliation. The same scenario we just saw in Exodus 12 and Leviticus 24 is repeated in Numbers 15. In this case, the text our Torah-keeping Christian friends point to is verse 16, which says, "The same laws and regulations will apply both to you and to the foreigner residing among you." And when you quote it all by itself like that, this verse seems to support the Hebrew roots position, doesn't it? But let's shine the light of context on it and see what we have here. Now, verse 16 is found in a longer passage that runs from verse 1 through verse 21, in which the Lord is giving Moses the laws about supplementary offerings. So in the Torah, a supplementary offering refers to an additional offering beyond those required by the law. These were offerings made voluntarily as an expression of gratitude or repentance or dedication or celebration. This includes things like shalomim, the peace offering, and nadava, the free will offering. And while they weren't required, they were certainly encouraged as a means of deepening your connection with Yahweh and expressing devotion to Him. Now, we don't need to read through this entire passage, but let's look at the first few verses to get our bearings. Verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, after you enter the land I am giving you as a home, and you present to the Lord food offerings from the herd or the flock as an aroma pleasing to the Lord, whether burnt offerings or sacrifices for special vows or free will offerings or festival offerings." So you can see these are supplementary offerings. And the text goes on to describe all kinds of specific requirements for them. For example, a grain offering is to be 1/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with 1/4 of hin of olive oil. And offering a ram also requires a grain offering of flour mixed with olive oil and also wine. So this is God, through Moses, preparing the Israelites for the proper way to make these kinds of offerings. And then, picking up at verse 13, everyone who is native born must do these things in this way when they present a food offering as an aroma pleasing to the Lord. For the generations to come, whenever a foreigner or anyone else living among you presents a food offering as an aroma pleasing to the Lord, they must do exactly as you do. So strangers and sojourners who chose to live among the Israelites and chose to make these voluntary offerings are required to make them in the same way that native Israelites do it. That's really interesting. So just like the other passages we looked at, God makes a clear distinction between native-born Israelites and foreigners or Gentiles. Even when they're both told to do the same thing or that the same rules apply to them, Yahweh makes a point of distinguishing between the two groups of people. He doesn't simply say, "Hey, everyone do this." He maintains a distinction between Israelites and the foreigners among them. And he goes on to say in the next verse, the community is to have the same rules for you and the foreigner residing among you. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. Whoops. You and the foreigner shall be the same before the Lord. The same laws and regulations will apply both to you and to the foreigner residing among you. So the same laws and regulations mentioned in this passage aren't a reference to the entirety of the law of Moses, but in context we can see these laws refer to the common rules for supplemental offerings and sacrifices in Israel. And the final example of this one law idea appears with just a few verses later in this same chapter. After that passage about supplemental offerings we just looked at, Numbers 15 then goes on to discuss laws about unintentional sins in verses 22 through 31. And in this passage, verse 29 is another example of a verse sometimes taken out of context by our Hebrew roots friends. It says this, "One and the same law applies to everyone who sins unintentionally, whether a native-born Israelite or a foreigner residing among you." And here again, we have the exact same pattern we saw with the previous three passages. So in context, verses 22 through 25 talk about what to do if the entire community unintentionally fails to keep God's commandments for offerings. It says the priest will make a specific sacrifice, and then in verse 26 it says, the whole Israelite community and the foreigners residing among them will be forgiven because all the people were involved in the unintentional wrong. There's that distinction again between the Israelite community and the foreigners residing among them, right? They're not addressed as a single group of people. And then God speaks to the unintentional sins of individuals. Verse 27, "But if just one person sins unintentionally, that person must bring a year-old female goat for a sin offering. The priest is to make atonement before the Lord for the one who erred by sinning unintentionally, and when atonement has been made, that person will be forgiven." One and the same law applies to everyone who sins unintentionally, whether a native-born Israelite or a foreigner residing among you. So, which law applies to foreigners and Israelites alike? The entire law of Moses? No. The laws regarding offerings for unintentional sins. And this passage closes by saying that the same punishment is to be given to both foreigners and Israelites alike. Verse 30. But anyone who sins defiantly, whether native-born or foreigner, blasphemes the Lord and must be cut off from the people of Israel. Because they have despised the Lord's word and broken his commands, they must surely be cut off. Their guilt remains on them. So for those in defiance who are continually sinning against the Lord, whether they're a native-born or a foreigner, they are to be cut off. And the fact that Yahweh consistently refers to non-Israelites as foreigners and strangers and sojourners shows that he considered them different from Israel. In fact, let's drill down on that distinction a bit. So here's the thing. Babylonians, Hittites, Egyptians, and all the other Gentile nations were never commanded or expected to eat kosher, or keep Shabbat, or circumcise their men, or keep the Torah feasts. This wasn't required of Gentile nations, and we never see Gentiles judged or punished for not doing these things. The only people judged for that are the Israelites. Now, as we've just seen, when Gentiles lived with or traveled with the Israelites, they were judged under the same civil laws and subject to the same punishment for crimes, which is no different than an American committing a crime in Ireland and then being subject to the Irish punishment for that crime. And when it comes to participating in the rituals and worship of Yahweh, such as the Passover meal or offerings and sacrifices, Gentiles weren't required to do those things, but God did allow it. And I think this is one way that God began fulfilling his promise to Abraham in Genesis 12, that he would bless the nations through Abraham's descendants. Foreigners were welcomed into their community and allowed to worship Yahweh. This is a foreshadowing of the gospel, when God's promise was ultimately fulfilled by Jesus, who commands us to go and make disciples of all nations, not just Israel. The passages we looked at reveal that if a Gentile chose to participate in those things, Yahweh had some rules for them. The distinction between native Israelites and foreigners is maintained throughout the Torah, which shows us that Gentiles in Israel were not subject to the law in the same way that the Israelites were. And in some instances, they weren't subject to it at all. We saw how the Gentiles weren't required to keep Passover. For them, it was optional. They were also held to a different dietary standard. In Deuteronomy 14, Yahweh commanded Israel, "Do not eat anything you find already dead. You may give it to the foreigner residing in any of your towns, and they may eat it, or you may sell it to any other foreigner. But you are a people holy to the Lord your God." So this is the Torah telling us in no uncertain terms that Gentiles were allowed to eat things that the Israelites were not. And this verse tells us why. The reason was holiness, which means set apart for God. Yahweh is saying, hey, Gentiles can eat that stuff, but I don't want my people, the Israelites, eating it, because they are to be set apart and holy for me. In fact, every time God refers to them as two different groups of people, the native-born Israelite and the foreigner among them, he's reminding them of this distinction, this holiness. And by the way, this verse about dead animals also tells us that the eating of certain things wasn't inherently immoral or wrong. God would never condone immorality. And yet, he has no problem with foreigners eating things that were prohibited for Israel. The uncleanness of food that God talks about in the Torah is ritual uncleanness. This is why the Israelites couldn't eat it, but the foreigners could. We also see differences between Israelites and foreigners in God's commands about loaning money. Every seventh year, the Israelites were commanded to release what they had lent to their fellow Israelites, but not what they had lent to the Gentiles. Deuteronomy 15 says this, "And this is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor, his brother, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exact it, but whatever of yours is with your brother, your hand shall release. And Deuteronomy 23 reveals a similar command about charging interest on loans. You may charge a foreigner interest, but you may not charge your brother interest, that the Lord your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. So the Torah teaches a clear difference in the treatment of Israelites and foreigners under the law of Moses. Israelites can require repayment and charge interest on loans made to foreigners, but not so with their fellow Israelites. That's because the law of Moses was given to Israel alone. And yes, God made accommodations for Gentiles who lived and traveled with Israel, but passages like the ones we've just looked at underscore the distinction between Israel and the other nations, and the fact that the Mosaic laws were for Israel, rather than a universal set of laws given to all people. Now, were there some universal laws included in the law of Moses? Well, of course. But the universal commands given in the Mosaic law, those dealing with issues of right and wrong, like murder and adultery, all existed long before Mount Sinai. And we know that they were universal laws because we see God judging even Gentiles for things like murder and greed and sexual immorality and wickedness. Okay. Let me close by sharing the perspective of a trio of Messianic Jewish scholars on this issue. And why is that helpful? Well, as ethnic Hebrew-speaking Jews who were born and raised in Israel and have come to faith in Jesus, these guys are keenly aware of the role that the Mosaic law played for the ancient people of Israel. So let me read a short passage from the book, Reading Moses, Seeing Jesus. I think you'll find it fascinating. Let's jump a few thousand years back to the time of the ancient Near East, a culture and mindset completely foreign to ours today, whose social structures are badly damaged by the fall. Within this context, God raises up a new nation with new laws to live by in order to create a new culture for them. In doing so, he adapts his expectations to a people whose attitudes and actions are subject to influence by the pagan nations around them. These laws aren't the permanent divine ideal for all peoples everywhere at all times. They are specific to that people with their specific needs in that ancient era. Take, for example, God's ideal for marriage, a monogamous union joining husband and wife as one flesh. When God is dealing with Israel, a nation of fallen humans affected by their surroundings in the ancient Near East, God's ideals are distorted and forgotten. Therefore, God is on the move to restore his ideals through this small new nation. The laws of Moses are a first step in that process. And to close the loop on the idea here about God's ideal for marriage, they're referring to the words of Jesus in Matthew 19:8, when he answered the Pharisees by saying, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so." In other words, the law that Yahweh gave to Israel at Sinai, while it was holy and righteous and good, it didn't represent his ultimate ideal for all people at all times. And that's why the theology of Torahism is so dangerous. It promotes the idea that followers of Jesus today need to return to the law that God gave to ancient Israel at that time for that culture. Now, are God's commands holy and perfect? Absolutely. But not every command that God has given applies to every person at all times. We've just seen how some Mosaic commandments didn't even apply to foreigners while they were in Israel. We're each only expected to keep the commands of God that apply to us. And the law of Moses does not apply to followers of Jesus who are under the new covenant. So telling Christians today that they're obligated to eat kosher or to keep the Torah feasts is kind of like telling Moses that he's required to build an ark. No, that was a command for Noah in his time and setting, and it didn't apply to Moses. Likewise, the ceremonial Mosaic commands given to ancient Israel don't apply to Christians today. Thanks for tuning in. Shalom.